And I guess the basic question is, why were they there? Why did they go to Utah? What events caused this to happen? And that's where the whole history of polygamy does tie into this. And it isn't the only reason, but I'd like to give just a very short overview of the history, how the church, when the church started, give you a little bit idea of the dates and some of the events that happened that kind of pushed them out of the east and made them come west. I would like to point out something as I go through some of this information today. Most members of the Mormon Church do not have access to or do not know a lot of the details I'm going to give you today. For a long, long time, the church controlled most of the information about its history. And it's only been since the internet has kind of exploded that people have been able to get a lot more access to information. There was a period of time when the archives of the church were let open to some really good historians who collected a lot of information that had never been published before. When the church realized that these historians were starting to publish this information, they shut the archives back down, and there's never been access to them. And that was about 20 years ago when they shut them back down. So since that time, there's one particular man, his name is Michael Quinn, who was a professor at BYU and voted favorite professor of the year and so forth and so on. And he was in the archives for about 3 years. And I spoke to him once a few years ago, and I said, how do you keep publishing these books? Where are you getting this information now that everything's shut down? And he said, you have no idea how much I was allowed to copy and take out during that time. So he has trunks full of information and has published just some wonderfully professional history about the early days of the church. It's often, I know last time I've talked, the last 2 times, people just kind of shake their head and say, how can people, believe this, or how come people don't know this? I just guarantee you that most members of the church, are devout, believing people who believe what they've been told is the whole story. And so I'm very sensitive about that because so much of my family is still in it. And those of us who have left, we just kind of knock ourselves on the head sometimes and say, how did I ever, Well, that's all we knew. I grew up in it. That's what I was taught. And I had a devout testimony that the things that I was told were true, and that Mormonism was the one and only true way. I would guess 95% of active Mormons today have never heard some of the things that I will tell you today. And that explains, their devotion. Joseph Smith was a very young boy, and from a very young age was quite involved with a lot of kind of suspicious activities. He became involved with the occult. He became very involved with what they called treasure digging in those days, which was the early 1800s. That was a very popular thing. There were a lot of men who went around with divining rods or with special seer stones and stuff, and they would be hired by people to dig for treasure. There was just a lot of rumors about buried treasure in those days, and Joseph Smith was very involved in that. And at the time, when he was in his teens, there was a religious movement going on in the New York and Pennsylvania area, and it became known as the Burned Over District because there were so many revivals going on and so much Pentecostal kind of thing going on, and his family was very involved in that, and everybody was seeking the truth. Everybody was seeking to know which church was the one. What did God want him to do? And that was part of his environment and part of his history. And according to the history of the church, when he was 14 years old, he sought God out and asked to be told what church to join. And at the time he did this, he, according to his history, was visited by God the Father, Elohim, and his son Jesus Christ, who appeared to him as 2 visible personages, and they spoke to him. And his history was really not written down until several years after these events. And one of the things that I discovered, which helped lead me out of the church, was the realization that many of the events and things that are in the official church history did not appear in the first 1 or 2 versions that he finally wrote down. And he didn't write them down until about 10 to 12 years after some of these things happened. But according to him, these personages appeared to him and told him that none of the churches were correct. In fact, they were an abomination to God, and he was not to join any of them. Later on, he had other visitations from angels, and eventually, according to his history, was led to a place on a mountain where he dug up an ancient record that was inscribed on gold plates, and he then eventually transcribed those plates, and that is what became the Book of Mormon. And he was, the Book of Mormon was published in 1830, and just a few weeks after that, the Church of Jesus Christ, as it was known then, which was the Church of Christ, was organized. He was 25 years old at the time, so there'd been, several years had gone, 11 or 12 years had gone since the time he had supposedly his first vision. Then the church, they jostled the name around some. During this first year, it became the Church of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Church of God. In 1834, it became Church of the Latter-day Saints. And remember, the name of the church, as I was taught, was that it had been revealed by God what the name of the church was to be. We didn't know that, I didn't know. We had all these iterations. And then in 1838, it became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1851, after they got to Utah, it was finally incorporated as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with a hyphen. And in 1887, and I'll tell you more about this, the church was dissolved by the federal government because of the polygamy issue. And from that time, which is a fact I did not know until I was preparing this talk, the church itself has been unincorporated. And I'm pretty sure I know the reason for that. But it calls itself an unincorporated religious association. But there are many, many corporations that the church owns that are mostly having to do with the business and the property that it owns and some of the historical artifacts and things like that. So that's kind of the history of how the name of the church evolved. After Joseph...
Could you say something about how the federal government dissolves churches?
Well, I'll get to that. Well, I don't know the technical... Yeah, I can tell you that, but can I set it aside for a minute? Remind me if I don't cover it, because I think I will.
Do you want him to hold questions?
Yeah, let's hold questions for a while, but I'm definitely going to give more time for questions this time, because we've just never had enough time at the end. As I said, this atmosphere in which the church was created was ripe for, deep religious introspection. People were just, it was a rough time economically for people, and they were looking for, I think, comfort, and that's one reason people were seeking religion so much. And the story that Joseph told was very appealing to people, and I think that there's something within our human involvement that wants to be involved with the one and only, or to be special, and I think that was the appeal. And Joseph Smith was a very charismatic man, and there's account after account after account about how people just, when they met him, they were just bowled over, and certainly the women were bowled over. But the men were too. There were many accounts from men who talked about how much they loved him, and they would sacrifice anything for him, and a lot of them did. There were just a tremendous amount of converts. He often would meet other preachers and reverends who had congregations, and the reverend would become convinced that Joseph's story was true, and he would bring his whole congregation in with him. So sometimes there were like mass conversions, and the church did grow quite rapidly, and they sent the missionaries out right off the bat. Sent a lot of them to Europe, and there was a huge infusion of converts. from Europe, particularly from the British Isles.